This video is really not for most of you critters because I'm talking about psychopathy and sociopathy. And I'm kind of directing this specifically towards those individuals who think of themselves as sociopaths or psychopaths or have been diagnosed as such. The primary psychopath I have kind of known in depth was Dean DeGena. And I don't know how much of a psychopath Dean actually was. He believed he was a clinical psychopath. He had been, unless I'm badly mistaken, diagnosed as such, but I'm not convinced he was a clinical psychopath. Now, I have been around other people I won't talk about, and I don't really believe necessarily in the existence of the psychopath. I believe there's a lot of factors in play, and what a lot of people associate with psychopathy, being a psychopath, is violent rage. And a lot of guys are capable of that. Some people will even think they're sociopaths because they can go from being a normal human being, loving father, husband, brother, son, whatever, pillar of the community, to being a violent individual with a ferocious temper at the drop of a hat. I don't believe this is necessarily a sign of either sociopathy or psychopathy. I believe these qualities have been primarily designated as such and are largely being bred out of men, and certainly being ruthlessly stamped out of humans. And it has been stigmatized, for some time now, violent rage, because, well, it's been violent, unthinking rage. There's not been any coherency behind it. There's not been any mindset or mind behind the rage. And obviously, that's just our perception of it in modern society. Often enough, there's a considerable amount of thought going in behind these violent rages, and there are viable and good reasons for these acts of violence. But for one thing, all too often, individuals can't articulate such their raison, whatever, for the raison d'etre I was thinking, but just a general, they can't articulate a case for their violent rage. And so they become mute. They don't have any representation in society. They're like smokers. And they're in a very awkward position because they are stigmatized, they are villainized, etc., etc. It's impossible to empathize with them because they have violent rages. And all too often, the wrong people get hurt by friendly fire, so they end up traumatizing people, being the reason for people's trauma and PTSD and such and such. The greatest enemy of our society is violent rage. And I hope to do a series about violent rage, because violent rage, I believe, is the cornerstone of masculinity. And men have lost the connection between the mind and the ability to engage in violent rage. But getting back to the point at hand, I think for a large period of time, people have had the ability to have greater self-control, self-discipline, what have you. And in the past decades, since Wyndham Lewis, I believe, came up with the idea of the cult of the child, especially so in the 20th century, the idea of the cult of the child, and the whole deal with the child now being a boutique ornament. And it is primarily or largely or often replaced by a dog nowadays as the object of affections in the individual family, which the last couple of generations since Generation X, they were conceived to fulfill their parents' biological imperatives and not for any other reason. And then you had Zoomers, which were, as I said, they were conceived basically because the parents were expected to. It was society expecting to them. Their minds combined with their biology were basically making them make children for no specific reason or no important reason. So what happens after this, the result of this, in other words, is that these young kids grow up without a purpose from birth. From the time of their conception, they don't have a purpose actually. And they grow up, and the next step is that since they don't have a purpose, they don't have any training or discipline, or they exist as an object to consume. So they exist, and they're no longer a citizen. Their designation is consumer. And you don't have the less discipline you have, the better when you're a consumer. So the psychopaths of the past, I've always thought of them, were very controlled individuals because they were afraid of they could have been afraid of the society as a whole. So serial killers and so forth and so on, people who simply had no fear but had some sense of discipline. So they had no fear or emotional or moral constraint, but they had other constraints in their life. So that governed a lot of their lives. So they lived their lives very differently. But if we look at, for example, the whole narrative of the Nazis being the most evil people in the world, then we realize that whole narrative, not just the concentration camps, but the myth of specific Nazi cruelty compared to people in every other war, in every other modern war, it wasn't there, And so, in other words, when we look at what the Nazis were facing with the Slavic horde and everything else, they fought just like every other nation confronted with similar problems would fight. And there was nothing untoward about what they did when we compare it with other nations in their position throughout history when confronted with similar circumstances. So that makes everybody in their group not a psychopath for the most part. And so the absence of certain qualities or certain scientific or biological factors in your mind does not mean that you cannot function in a society. And the only reason I think psychopaths do not function or are thought of as dysfunctional is society, to a certain extent, prioritizes all types of dysfunction in the sense that it is breaking down and altering the culture in the Western world, and therefore any kind of dysfunction is a positive because it helps to overthrow the existing order, the social order, that is, not the political order. The political order must alter the social order, or the social order will alter the political order. It's pretty much that simple. So, all that being said, as I was thinking about it, those individuals, you often think, oh, I'm a sociopath, I become a sociopath, I become a psychopath. I just, for the most part, have not seen circumstances in which these individuals did not have the free will to act in a way that was not, or act in a way that was different from their nature. So they had every opportunity to not act in a violent or antisocial way. Some people took it and some people didn't. But for the most part, you see a lot of people, in fact, who have a certain level of direction, thriving in society. And it's just certain types of genetic strains that are stigmatized for being psychopaths and sociopaths and so forth and so on. So, okay, it's this way. You are this way. You will be punished for it. You will be perhaps victimized, treated as a victim, but you will also be punished in your own way by being treated as a victim. That's your punishment, to be treated as a victim instead of being raised up from your condition, or you're basically pathologized, and that's a problem for you because you're never going to be able to live a normal or above normal life. So that's all a factor in the situation, and this is why the situation is as it is. There's nothing that, for the most part, an individual cannot correct themselves, and an individual does not have to accept these diagnoses as interfering with their life in any way. Now, in the case of violent rage, people really need to reconcile that, because violent rage is a great tool for men if it's properly used, and it's a great incentive in a lot of ways when properly disciplined. It's like a blunt object that can be honed into an extremely dangerous object, which can be used as an extremely dangerous object if it's honed and refined and repaired and made into something better. But the raw fury of the raw ferocity of people's undisciplined tempers, throwing temper tantrums of things many people think are unimportant, that's unacceptable, and you need to get over that. We'll talk more about that in future broadcasts.